Okay, this is a lesson for the Cornet project class. They meet on Sunday morning. That's where we meet. This video is produced for them, but of course, the first is everyone at Landmark Missionary Baptist Church, and then anyone who wants to avail themselves. But I want to answer the question, why aren't we smart enough to know what we're missing? Well, this is just an approach to the Bible that is all too common. We can presume to know things because we were told them or primed, if you will. And we know that that doesn't work in mathematics or chemistry or physics, or if you sign up for a calculus class, trigonometry class, whatever. You know that whatever you bring to the table really won't have any influence over the subject matter in what is called hard sciences. So sometimes we might presume, let's say the Bible is open, that is, we might presume it doesn't appear in a particular language. We might presume that we don't have tools for linguistics, or we can assume that what we were told is important enough and we know enough to get by. We might not ever consult lists of words, for example, in Hebrew, and we may not find very many people carry these around and bend them like I do, keep it in my pocket, my strong verb forms, just core elements of a subject. So when we just consider the Bible open, or it's really not something we can know, then we won't have little use for little tools like this. And that's about an opinion. You know, it's if you know enough Bible to navigate, and a lot of organizations are just social organizations. People aren't really there to learn and understand the words in the Bible and their relationships. And now they wouldn't treat their English grammar class in college if it's an assigned or an element of the core curriculum for designed curriculum for a degree pursuit. It's just a lot of this you'll see today. People say we really don't need the Bible. Literally, articles are being written showing that knowledge of the Bible is unnecessary. So this is just a lesson to explain that to the extent your opinion of the Bible is held, it might be the biggest barrier when you really don't need it. That would be presumption or presumptuous, or if you don't respect it as a subject matter, as something else that you may or may not have studied, but you know that subject's out there. For example, when young versus old Earth paid a visit to Landmark, a lot of you weren't here then, but people were so busy picking their side or advocating their side that they couldn't know. So one of the reasons why we can't know, why we're not smart enough to know what we're missing, is because we might assume, and one of the first things I was taught at the Missionary Baptist Seminary is not to assume anything. And that's just really easy to do, though. We might be lazy, or might think the effort we've invested in studying something is sufficient. But it was impossible for those who had an interest in that conflict to know about instant and spoken creation. So whatever the conflict was, or the emotion was, it was certainly not a cognitive conflict. It was more emotional, and proof texting followed. For example, when instant creation, instant is acknowledged in Genesis 1:1, then no conflict exists in Genesis 1:2, then 6 literal days is not in question. They're not in question. What happened here to the earth, we don't have now a creation story that finds the original creation formless and void. That's what happened. We then, but you can't know this. We can't know. There's a proof, a demonstration here, Hebrews 11:1. Or 11:3, where the earth was mended. Now the first earth matter is still here. That first earth matter doesn't pass away until the end of the age and prior to the new earth. But why we can't know this, why we can't know instant and spoken, and why we don't, then that's why there will be a toggle here. Let's say there will be a young versus old. There will be a be versus become. You don't even get past. So here's Genesis 1:1. So now you have that in Genesis 1:2. And then when you start at Genesis 1:3, you have the question of literal days or day ages. And then, of course, and this all begins by just simply, if we aren't smart enough to know that we don't know any subject, we don't approach any subject like can often be observed when someone approaches the Bible. So if by just omitting instant omit instant and spoken creation, just take that out, and now you have things here that will never be reconciled. They will never be resolved. This will always be in question. So that's a lot of power in the unity, the synthesis of the text, that if you were to omit one thing, certainly not intentionally, only you would know. So as you are in this class, it's not, accusations are quite irrelevant, especially knowing that evaluation is the way we learn. And so we evaluate to find out what is it. I haven't found a case yet, class. I haven't found a case anywhere, and we can Google things now. So I haven't found a case anywhere against instant creation. That would be the youngest earth, youngest. That is youngest in the amount of time to create, which would be timeless, no time at all. Timeless, instant. So that's in Isaiah 48. Anyway, you can read about that, but we can move on and see why we aren't smart enough to know what we're missing, because we would have to have knowledge of the subject. That is, we would have to have read the Bible, but there's so many words in the Bible, and it's such a large amount of data that cognitive load theory states that we can experience overload quite easily. So we'll work with only what we can carry, figuratively speaking. So what we can mentally process, we'll work with that data. And that's why in this class I've shown you that if we really wanted to see how concise the Bible is, let's remove the conflicts and the flummoxes. Let's place instant and spoken creation. So now we can do away with young versus old, which that's a large amount that now you can see how this becomes clear. Now we don't have be or become, we have become. There is no be verb in Hebrew. So now it's clearing up quite well. If we want to reduce the amount of load to think and understand, now we can move straight from instant to now we have what became here, and then we have the 6 days are now easily literal without any contradiction. We've got that. We've got a repaired earth now. We don't have to remove that. I mean, we could take more time bantering what would never be resolved. If someone's old earth, they'll never be young earth. Someone's young earth, they'll never be old earth. And yet now we've already moved along to where we appreciate God preparing, that is Jesus the Christ, preparing the earth for humanity. And as we move on, now we're there because we have the question now comes. So we've left the young versus old behind. And yes, you may do that. And it may not find you invited to a lot of conferences because people really like the banter, they like the dissonance, they like the energy that it generates, which is certainly a strategy. If you are seeking to apprehend someone's attention, certainly pick a side, and then when you're finished bantering, because you can, as I remind you, there's no such thing as a young versus old Adam argument, and everyone knows that he was created in under 12 hours. And he was a man. He wasn't an infant. He wasn't there growing up to develop over a span of time. He was created in hours and was a grown man. So in 12 hours or less, daylight, when God worked, he was created, and yet he was, let's say, 30 years old. So that's just the phenomenon of creation. Everything created is always older than the time it took to produce it. Okay, so now here we come to open versus closed theism. And there's a lot of alarm about this today. And this, I don't know. This is just really generic, very common assertions. Some have said God knows everything. But unless you know the text that says his intelligence is infinite, then you might not notice that everything is finite. And that's not fun for people because his knowledge is infinite, and he would decide how much to know because he's the creator of knowledge. For example, someone said that God only knows the things that are knowable. Well, he determines that. Someone said God can only do the things that are possible to be done. Well, he determines what's possible to be done. So these are just, this closed assertion, I think, reflects back to everything's determined. And that's, unless you know the Bible, and this again, why we aren't smart enough to know what we're missing, we won't notice that in the Bible, the living theism. So you don't need closed, and you don't need open. You can just scratch those out. Because even our argument has nothing to do with why God identified himself as the living God, which was a contrast to idolatry. And again, that there is a case in, I think the ESV translates stubbornness as presumption. If you want to ignore this, then now you're talking about the error of commission. That's not what this class is about. Only you would know if you deliberately want to ignore what the text says for whatever investment you have being served. So if we have living theism, now we've moved on to quite a large improvement in just how concise our knowledge can be. So young and old, young versus old's off the table. Now we go instant, became, 6 literal days, repaired earth. Now we have living God and the context. And if you respect the sovereignty, for example, of God, that is absolute. Sovereignty is absolute. God's sovereignty is not conditioned upon any assertions or qualifications that we impose upon him. Often people will banter about, well, if God's sovereign, then man doesn't have a free will. And now we moved right into that, for example. This is about idolatry from the time the Hebrews, or the Hebrew emancipates were in the Bible, Deuteronomy, where from the dark, thunderous cloud they heard the voice of the living God. Well, they had been in Egypt, where dumb idols were all they knew, and impotent gods, plural. And now the voice of the living God so troubled them that they asked Moses to go and speak with him. And they not directly, immediately hear from him directly like that. Well, then at the end of the Bible, we see the living God, the seal of the living God, and the implication of the living God as the global practice of idolatry, even to the point of idol or beast worship. And that beast is a thing. So the implication there is what the Bible's about. If you recognize God's sovereignty, then the ordained means of carrying out his will on this earth is to teach what the attributes he assigns to himself, and not to, well, for example, just to take a brief look here at the idea of even adjective, for example, which a lot of times we don't think about it. But an adjective is a word used to modify. It actually means that which is thrown near. You notice adjective as in trajectory. Adject is that which is thrown near the noun or pronoun. So sometimes why we aren't smart enough to know what we're missing is because we've thrown an adjective. Let's say we say open or closed, and we've not only threw that alongside a noun, theism, but we've invented that. So if we just remove that, if you want to just study the Bible, again, this is a class about supporting the Bible. And then if you want to talk about, the question comes to sovereignty, absolute. Well, when we talk about sovereignty, the Bible talks about he's king. And then, of course, his kingdom, and Jesus, God in the flesh, the fullness of Godhead bodily, taught about his kingdom and how that kingdom works and how he rules. And the Bible speaks of that. So there are no conditions that we can place here. Again, when we talk about even his all-knowingness, he determines what he knows and doesn't know. That's because he's all-powerful. He determines what can and can't be done, what's possible or not. Someone placed, you'll hear the riddle, can the Almighty God create a rock so large that he can't lift it? And I've heard some charming responses to that. And some have even said, well, God, being almighty, can only do the things that are able to be done. Well, that's, I'm not going to ridicule the person saying it, but the statement is silly. He determines what's done. And yes, he can create a rock that he can't lift, because only someone with all power could restrain that power. And Jesus demonstrated what it was for God to deliberately condescend, for God to deliberately inhibit himself, limit himself. So we don't have a question about how his living theism works. We don't have a question about his sovereignty. We don't have a question as raised up about free will. There's the assertion of libertarian. How this became part of the Baptist glossary, I don't know. Libertarian or compatibilism. I think someone pointed out I'd misspelled this, but I'm not sure it matters if an atheistic philosopher developed a concept that I might then misspell. But I thought it was hilarious that they could notice that. So class, when you're studying the Bible, you want to just move on and understand it. If you want to play God's sovereignty versus free will, that would be an error of commission. You're literally wanting to do that, because by now you've noticed, unless we define our terms or include what the Bible actually says, we're not really having a Bible conversation. So here, man, the Bible teaches man is causal. So causal agency is what the Bible teaches. And of course, it doesn't do a lot for the battle or the banter. Let's say, someone who's stubborn or presumptive, which we all have that in us. So it's nothing we can't identify readily in ourselves first. But for example, this tiny little book, English Grammar to Ace Biblical Hebrew. It's a little modern book. That's why I got it, because I knew the way people are talking, it almost make you want to question yourself when you attended seminary and you did so well in school and you were learning the languages and how to use the tools, and then later people invite you into some vain banter that has nothing to do with the Bible. And let's say you're like me, you still have your Hebrew grammar book, and you remember Hifil and causal agency, and you remember all these notes you took. And you don't really know what's going on out there, why people are arguing about libertarian or compatibilism and what all the big deal is. And you certainly don't know why people are arguing about be or become. So you remember and you remind yourself, well, the Bible is an actual objective reality of Scripture that can be studied. It has its own languages by particular authors written over a span of time. So you can go here and go to Hebrew Action Heroes, and I understand people can't, I don't expect you to read this, but when you get one of these are really nice. They're very inexpensive, but it talks about the causative stem right here. And so if we want to know the relationship of the subject to the action, the Bible says that Abram in Genesis 15:6, when you look that up according to the inflectional morpheme, he caused himself to believe. So how many more things do we not know? Why we aren't smart enough to know what we're missing is because if we don't bother to study the subject matter, I certainly have learned something that I can't really get people to answer, because the ones I'm most interested in talking with are the ones least interested in self-indictment. Because I always ask, why does it not bother me that someone says young earth or someone says old earth? But when I support the text, it seems to bother them when someone says they think this is was, which is an English assertion, but yet this, in Hebrew, there is no be verb. This is become. And instant creation settles that. 6 literal days are proven. We have a repaired earth. We have a living God. We have an absolute sovereign king. We have causal agency of man. None of these contradict, but it's because we can't generate dissonance, class. You might notice that people's interest in the actual knowledge, I mean, is the view worth the climb? I mean, because to go through a Hebrew class, you'd have to really want to know these parts of speech. You'd have to really want to know the context. You'd have to really want to appreciate. You'd have to actually be someone that God's using to carry out his purpose. And without love of God and being called according to its purpose, there's not really much that would find you interested in answering this exactly. And I think this is enough because our class, this is enough for our lessons. I'll just say this is our lesson that answers the question. This is enough of an example, but you can see how concise it would be. And if it's important for people to know the Bible, then being concise would be an advantage. It'd be a very practical way of quickly and efficiently communicating the information and to remove the bottlenecks or the flummoxes or the contradictions that don't exist. So this is enough. Enjoy this lesson, and if I can be in the class for the discussion, I'll be there for that. Otherwise, you have plenty of people in your class to go over this with you. So have a blessed day.